Okay, hello everyone. So just as you're joining in now, just wait till the numbers stop going up. I think everyone's sort of connecting in, and then I'll go through some things. But if you'd like to all introduce yourself in the chat as you come on, feel free to do that and say where you're from. And other than that, we'll just wait till 4 to start to give everyone a chance. So yeah, as you're joining, if you want to introduce yourself, so just a few things really. If you've got questions during the talk, make sure you can either put them in the chat or you can put them in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of the Zoom. And then at the end of the talk, I will ask your questions to Thor, who will answer them. Yeah, so feel free to put them in either the chat or the Q&A, although the Q&A box is probably easier. And we'll try and do our best to answer all of the questions at the end. But for now, let me just introduce our speaker today. So this is Thor. He's joining us from the Pacific Northwest over in America. And Thor is an author and biologist, including of his latest book, Hurricane Lizards and Plastic Squid. And he is here today to talk to us about how species are responding to the climate crisis. So without further ado, I guess I'll just pass on to you, Thor, if you want to take it away from here.
Well, thank you for inviting me to join you today. It is a pleasure. We were chatting before we logged into the start of the session here that I do live on an island in the state of Washington, off the coast, sort of right on the border with Canada, a very beautiful place to live, but not a place that has the most reliable internet service in the world. So to give a webinar like this, the procedure is that I drive in the car and park in the back parking lot of the library close enough to use their Wi-Fi. So if you look out here and see that it looks like that guy's in the back seat of a car, he is in the back seat of a car. That's how we roll here on San Juan Island in Washington State. But I want to jump right into our presentation today. So I'm going to share with you a portion of my screen, and hopefully you can all see a couple of frogs on a book cover there. But what I really want to do today is start right off the bat with an image that I think is extremely familiar to all of us, and that is the iconic image really now of the poor old polar bear stranded on an iceberg. And that has really become our go-to symbol for the biological impacts of climate change, so much so that the conversation all too often stops right there. In the media and in lectures and all kinds of public discourse, we invoke this poor polar bear as a dire warning, and then we move on. And doing so, we are overlooking a rich and vital biological story that really is at the heart of all climate change scenarios. Because what matters is not so much the change itself as the response to that change. If every species got along just as well in all conditions, then tweaking the weather one way or another wouldn't matter in the slightest. But of course, that's not how nature works. The diversity of life on Earth, as we all know, stems from specialization. It is a great accumulation of species that have all adapted to particular environmental conditions. And when those conditions change, well, species react. They must react. And it is the sum of those reactions that will determine the future, theirs as well as our own. So today, what I want to do is really focus on the challenges that climate change creates for plants and for animals and for mammals, of course, being the Mammal Society here. Uh, so we can really see these things playing out, and we can measure them playing out all around us in nature. So the responses are often summarized, at least in biological circles, by the acronym MAD. Species either move, they either adapt, or they die. But as we explore these examples today, I think you will come away agreeing with me that it's really a lot more complicated than that. So as you can imagine, this is a booming field of study right now. Climate impacts are so widespread that it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that all biologists are studying climate change. Some of them just don't know it yet. Now, it helps to organize this deluge of data and information into themes, and one of the most common themes has to do with timing. So, if we shift to this character here, Henry David Thoreau, at Walden Pond, well, the violets and the wood sorrel that he wrote about in the 19th century, and he admired them in May when they were in May and June. Well, those flowers now bloom at Walden in late April. And what he called the early yellow smell of willows can reliably be savored in March. Spring is arriving earlier and earlier. You can see it happen in your own backyard. And if you write your observations down, as Thoreau did, they might one day become valuable. His meticulous notes on the plants and the birds at Walden are now a vital baseline for modern comparisons. One expert told me that if Thoreau was listed on a co-author on all the papers using his data, he would be one of the most prolific climate scientists of the 21st century. But a modern spring isn't just earlier than what Thoreau saw, it's different. To Thoreau, it might seem like a season in disarray. That's because not all species are responding in the same ways or even at the same times. Now, this little flower is common on the island where I live. In fact, it's common throughout the western part of North America. It's known as death camas. And like many plants, it produces toxins to ward off would-be attackers. But unlike most other plants, it doesn't just put those chemicals into its leaves and seeds and other places that are likely to be nibbled. It puts them everywhere, including in its pollen and its nectar. What's more, the main toxin in the mix, zygosine, is especially nasty stuff. It attacks the heart, it attacks the lungs, and for good measure, it attacks the digestive tract, meaning you'll have an upset stomach while you perish. So its Latin name really says it all. This plant is called, to a botanist, Toxicoscordion venenosum venenosum, which translates to poisonous bulb, poisonous, poisonous. So death camas is very well protected, but in terms of pollination, it's really in a bit of a bind. I mean, how do you attract insects to your flowers when instead of a tasty reward, you are offering them seizures and paralysis and ultimately death? So enter the appropriately named death camas bee, one of a handful of species and the only bee that has figured out a way to tolerate or even detoxify death camas poison. Now that gives the bee an exclusive source of pollen and nectar, and it gives the flower a dedicated pollinator. It's a very tight and very specialized, codependent relationship. But in many locations, death camas now blooms weeks earlier than it did just 20 or 30 years ago, responding to the steady rise in springtime temperatures. The bee, on the other hand, appears to be remaining on the old schedule. It nests below the ground, and soil warms more slowly than the surface and air temperatures that are impacting the camas. So if that trend continues, it could lead to what biologists call a timing mismatch, where different responses threaten to separate or decouple the partners in a critical ecological relationship. The flower too early for the bee, and the bee too late for the flower. So these things are becoming separated not in space, but in time. And this is happening all over the place. Now, we worry about these specialized relationships like pollination because they're so vulnerable to timing problems. But these mismatches are cropping up all over the place. Everywhere from the Arctic, where we find migrating caribou, arriving at the calving grounds too late for the tundra plants that they feed upon, to migrating shorebirds, missing out on the peak productivity of the invertebrates that they are relying upon to fuel the next stage of their journey. Now, it can take decades, really, for the results of these sort of mismatches to become apparent. We know a lot of these things are happening, but it takes a lot of data and a lot of research often to tease apart what's going on. Sometimes the results of climate change are a lot more direct. They're very immediate, and these tend to be the ones that are associated with extremes in weather, increasingly harsh climatic conditions that simply push species beyond their comfort zone. The storms, the floods, the droughts that we're all reading about in the news aren't just affecting people, they're affecting all of the creatures in those environments. As one expert told me about rising temperatures, he said it's pretty simple. Sometimes organisms just get too hot. Now, one such example comes to us from the deserts of the American Southwest, where you might expect creatures to be well prepared for a warmer world. After all, they are living in the hottest place in North America. Now, this example is from a researcher named Barry Sinervo. He's a herpetologist at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and he studies lizards, including this species here, the western fence lizard, which is a species that, if your childhood was anything like mine, you might have tried and failed to catch lizards like the fence lizard. These things always scurry away at the last moment to hide under a nearby rock. Well, it turns out that fence lizards use rocks for a lot more than escaping from young lizard enthusiasts. They are what scientists call heliotherms. They use the sun to regulate their body temperature, basking on the tops of rocks to warm up and then retreating under rocks into the shade to cool down again. They can't just stay out in the sun all day because their bodies can't compensate and they would overheat and even perish. So, as temperatures have risen, particularly in these deserts and other prime reptile habitats, the lizards have done what they've always done on hot days. They spent more time in the shade. But that comes at a cost. Time devoted to hiding under rocks like this means less time spent out looking for food. So, as temperatures rise, their daily calorie intake starts to go down. Now, Barry and his crew watched a number of populations of these lizards just wink out before they realized that it wasn't just the heat killing the lizards directly. Instead, they were spending so much time in the shade that, particularly the females, weren't eating enough. They weren't building up enough energy reserves to reproduce. In other words, when it got too hot, the lizards stopped breeding. And it really doesn't take a PhD in herpetology to predict the long-term consequences of that. So another climate change challenge has to do with what fans of the old Jungle Book story might have called, at least the Disney version, might have called the bare necessities of life. The absurd song went along with that notion in the movie. What happens when some critical element of a species' habitat just disappears? Now, this is what we're talking about when we invoke the poor polar bear. The melting of the ice pack in the Arctic threatens the polar bears because it deprives them of the habitat where they hunt for these creatures, the seals that haul out to rest and also haul out to calve on the ice pack up there. When you remove the ice, the seals are harder to reach and the bears lose something critical, a bare necessity of their lives. But if you could look beyond the seals and the bears in these photographs and peer over the edge of these icebergs, you might catch a glimpse of another creature being impacted. That is this lovely little auk here, a tiny seabird. It's called the little auk, or some call it the dovekie. Marvelous little creature that feeds in the plankton-rich waters along the edges of ice flows. Now, that strategy has worked very well for little auks. They're quite common up in the Arctic. At least it worked well until the ice started retreating from places like this. This is a picture of Russia's Franz Josef Land archipelago. It's one of the places where dovekies breed on islands, right? So as the ice sheet or the ice floes retreat from these islands, the dovekies have farther and farther to fly to find food to bring back to the nest to feed to their offspring. So scientists have long predicted that the little auks would be an early casualty of climate change because at some point that distance would become too great, leading to starvation of chicks and once again to a population collapse. But that brings us to a really important point that I want to underscore to you today in this lecture, and that is this. Nature is not defenseless. Nature is not a passive bystander to global warming. When the climate changes, species do react, and sometimes they do so in ways that we would never guess. So I want to catch up with this little auk story by reading to you a section from the book that I wrote about this whole climate change biology theme. And this is from a conversation with a French biologist named David Gremillet. He participated in an expedition to a remote dovekey little auk breeding colony up there in Franz Josef Land. And there's a picture of David. Yes. We had indeed strong hypotheses and predictions on how they would behave, Grimley explained, noting that birds in their previous studies had regularly flown over 60 miles to reach the edge of the pack ice. We were expecting flight times between the colony and the foraging spot of at least an hour, he went on. And then he recounted what he called, quote, one of the most exciting moments of my research career. Sitting with their laptops at the dinner table in this old Russian research station, with their Russian counterparts, they opened up the first batch of tracking data and saw precisely how long the birds had been in the air. Less than 4 minutes. Instead of trekking all the way to the edge of the sea ice, the little auks had apparently found an alternative food source right on their doorstep. But what and where? It's easy to imagine the excited conjecture and conversation that came next, perhaps fortified with a sip or two of vodka. Soon, their ideas began coalescing around an entirely new hypothesis. My colleague, Jerome Fort, remembered that what we had seen while climbing the nearby mountain with our Russian friends a week before, Gremillet recalled, and described a distinct line across the mouth of the fjord, where cloudy blue meltwater from island glaciers slammed into the dark, dense currents of the Arctic Ocean. Both Fort and Gremillet had trained as oceanographers before they began studying birds, so they understood the consequences of such an abrupt transition. We both knew what this front meant, a curtain of plankton, killed by temperature and osmotic shock. For tiny crustaceans, swimming so suddenly from one kind of water into another is like driving full speed into a wall. And for anything that fed upon those crustaceans, the resulting pileup created a bonanza. Testing their theory, however, required a boat, but the only craft available was a, quote, chronically deflated dinghy, and the fuel that they'd brought from Murmansk turned out to be contaminated with water. None of this was exactly ideal for exploring a polar sea, but they set off anyway and managed to sputter far enough out into the fjord for a survey. There wasn't much to see at first, but as soon as they crossed the convergence between the glacial meltwater and the ocean water, the little auks were suddenly all around them. The little auks were there, Gremillet told me, all aligned on the oceanic side, diving and stuffing themselves on plankton, easily picked from that underwater curtain. And with that revelation, the story of dovekies and climate change switched instantly from one of decline into one of resilience. Yes, the sea ice was melting, as predicted, but so were Arctic glaciers. And in places like Franz Josef Land, where those glaciers are plentiful, that created an opportunity that no one saw coming. Gremillet and his team spent the remainder of their field season showing that dovekies weren't just surviving on their new food source, they were thriving. To Gremillet, the project demonstrated how one overlooked detail can have a huge effect on the outcome. Even if you think you know, he summarized, you really have to get out into the field and check what wild creatures are doing, because they very often surprise you. So David Grimley's story embodies something that I heard again and again during my research for the climate change book. How scientists are going out into the field expecting to study one thing and ending up studying something entirely different, because conditions on the ground are so different from what they expected, different in terms of the climate and different in terms of the lives and activities of the plants and animals they've gone out to study. So the little auks were able to pivot quickly to a new food source because they have what scientists like to call plasticity. I don't know if anyone recalls Plastic Man, the old comic book hero from the 50s and the 60s. But these species with plasticity are like Plastic Man. They have this built-in ability to stretch themselves and to find ways to adapt. And in an era of rapid climate change, plasticity allows a rapid response. And for some species, it applies to a lot more than just how they behave. The Humboldt squid, for example, virtually disappeared from traditional fishing grounds in Mexico's Gulf of California after a series of climate-driven marine heat waves beginning in 2011, 2012. Or so everybody thought, until surveys found that the squid were not only still present, they were more abundant than ever. Instead of departing, they had responded to heat stress by adopting a radically different life strategy. They matured and reproduced in half the time and ate different foods. They also lived only half as long, and under those constraints, their new adult bodies could reach only a fraction of their former size. And if you look at this slide, you will see the former size on the top picture there, the large jumbo squid, as it's also known, the Humboldt squid. And in the bottom picture, also an adult now of the same species living in a warmer ocean, right? So they adapted so completely with plasticity that they are in fact too small now to bite on the lures that were previously used to catch them. Their rapid downsizing fooled the fishers, who had been dismissing the few they could hook as juveniles or perhaps another species altogether. So most climate change responses that we have measured to date in nature have been the result of plasticity, capabilities that were already baked in to a species' genetic makeup. But in some tantalizing cases, there are now signs of climate-driven evolution taking place. And one of the best examples comes to us again from a lizard, this time from a small lizard that is native to the Turks and Caicos Islands in the Caribbean. Colin Donahue, a scientist now at Washington University, had just surveyed the lizard population there as part of a study on the impacts of non-native rats. The idea was they were going to go out and study all of these native plants and animals and so forth, and then remove these invasive rats and then see how the native flora and fauna responded. But then a hurricane struck, and his research, as it so often does these days, took an unexpected turn. So let's pick up this story again, straight out of the book. This one begins with an epigraph, this chapter, that I really love, that I think says a lot about our era. It's from Giuseppe Lampedusa's novel. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend The Leopard, where he wrote, "If we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change." Actually, it was two hurricanes, Donahue clarified, when I called to ask him how the story had played out. Hurricane Irma struck first, pummeling the eastern Caribbean with torrential rains, storm surge, and Category 5 winds exceeding 175 miles per hour. Just 2 weeks later, Hurricane Maria swept through with similar force. The combined storms devastated low-lying islands like the ones where Donahue's lizards lived, uprooting trees, flattening structures, and leaving both the natural and human communities reeling. Needless to say, researchers put the rat project on an indefinite hold, but for Donahue, that setback also offered an opportunity. While his questions about lizards and rats would have to wait, he was now in the perfect position to study the effects of hurricanes. Had any lizards survived the storms? And if so, and if that surviving population was different from the one he'd just measured, then he might be able to document natural selection in action. We had no idea what to expect, he told me, but I knew we weren't going to get another chance at that kind of data. So he cobbled together some funding and headed back to the Caribbean and found himself in a sort of scientific deja vu, repeating the exact same field project he'd just completed 6 weeks earlier. We were on a short timeline, so it was pretty much catching and measuring lizards all day long, Donahue recalled. But he described the trip with obvious pleasure, as if this were precisely how anyone would want to spend their time on a tropical island. In conversation, Donahue's enthusiasm for science borders on exuberance. He comes across as someone who probably keeps working and thinking long after other people might quit for the day and retire to the poolside bar. That may be why he recognized the potential value of returning so soon to resurvey his lizards, and it's almost certainly why it occurred to him to bring along a leaf blower. The customs officer was very confused, he said, and laughed out loud at the memory of trying to explain the science behind traveling with a large piece of landscaping equipment. Well, we needed to know how the lizards behaved in a hurricane-force wind, he told me. It was entirely possible that they might run for it or hunker down in the tree roots. And since watching lizards in a real hurricane was out of the question, Donahue used the leaf blower to simulate one inside his hotel room. And I have to say, I've always wondered what the people in the next room thought about that. I mean, it's one thing if someone turns the TV on kind of loud, but a leaf blower for hour after hour. Well, at any rate, Colin was kind enough to share with me some photos of that experiment. He videoed the whole thing, so we can all see what he saw. But before I show you these images, let me assure you that no lizards were harmed. No lizards were harmed. There is a soft net directly off camera, and all the lizards were caught and safely returned to the wild. But here are some pictures of this experiment. The idea was you put a lizard on a stick, and then you have some equipment below there to measure the speed of the wind. You turn on the leaf blower, and you can see the lizard's rear legs begin to fly up into the wind until its entire body is flapping like a flag in the wind. It's holding on. You get the wind up to hurricane force, and the lizard drops off and flies into the net. Now, in addition to getting a lot of hits apparently on YouTube when he posted the video for the first time, this experiment showed Donahue and explained to him exactly what he had been seeing in his data. Because the post-hurricane lizard population was in fact measurably different. The survivors of those storms were the lizards that had the larger toe pads and the stronger front legs for holding on tight. You can see it in the video. They hold on tight with their front legs while the wind is blowing. But also the lizards, and this was something that was mysterious to him in the data until he did that experiment, is that they had these big front legs and these big toe pads, but their back legs were smaller. The survivors had small back legs, and he couldn't figure that out until he saw the images of the lizards with their bodies flapping like flags in the wind and realized that short back legs reduce the drag on the body and allow lizards to cling on to sticks and branches for just a few seconds longer. And in a hurricane, that can be the difference between life and death. So what he had seen then was, in fact, survival of the fittest in action. And later surveys showed that those very traits were being passed down to future generations. The lizards were, in fact, evolving in response to climate change, not over the course of centuries or thousands of years, but really something measurable within the space of a single field season. So climate change biology is full of those kinds of surprises. And I hope that you will agree with me that there's a lot more to it than a polar bear on an iceberg. Now, when I agreed to speak to you today, Alana asked me that I would mention some mammals in my talk, and there have been a few sprinkled in amongst the lizards. But I guarantee you that the last story I want to share with you does have some mammals in it. But it begins not with a mammal, but with a plant. Well, actually, it begins with a very famous rock and roll album. But if you look behind you too, if you look behind the band, you're going to see the plant that inspired the name for the Joshua Tree album. That is a Joshua tree itself, which is a large plant in the yucca family that is native to the Mojave Desert in the American Southwest. Now, historically, Joshua tree populations have shifted north during warm periods, and they've shifted south when temperatures have cooled, right? This is something that we know from the fossil record. They've moved around. But this time around, as the planet heats up, that simply isn't happening. Many populations appear to be at risk of dying out within a few decades. It's possible that Joshua Tree National Park will lack its namesake tree. But the tree is not disappearing for lack of habitat. There are plenty of areas to the north that are, in fact, becoming more and more suitable for Joshua trees. But the trees can't get there. Something is missing. But what? Well, the answer comes to us from research by a fellow named Ken Cole, who is a paleobotanist, a specialist in plants of the past. And Ken knows where Joshua trees used to occur because of the seeds and leaves preserved in the middens of pack rats. Now, pack rats build enormous mounds of material to make their nests, and their urine has a special preservative-like quality. In fact, they pee in these nests, and the urine hardens and becomes almost like an amber. It preserves everything that is contained within it. And that allows researchers like Ken to take these chunks of pack rat midden from the past, take them apart, dissolve them, and study the plant remains within them and reconstruct plant communities dating back 50,000 years. They may even be older than that, but 50,000 is the limit that you can carbon date these materials. There may be pack rat middens out there that are even older than 50,000 years. Really an incredible resource for paleobotanists. If you can get over the fact that you're working with solidified urine. So Ken knew very well where Joshua trees had occurred in the past because the pack rats would gather the fruits and take leaves and fruits back to their nests, and they don't travel far. They only go within 100 yards or so of the nest. So if you find these remains in a nest, you know for a fact there were Joshua trees growing very nearby. So this was a very effective way for him to map where these plants had been. But again, if the pack rats then are only moving 100 yards or so, then how were these Joshua trees moving such large distances to keep up with past changes in the climate? There must have been something else in that landscape. Well, luckily for Ken and for the rest of us, pack rats aren't the only desert creatures that leave behind piles of old plant debris. This is an image of a Shasta giant ground sloth, a species that was hunted to extinction 12,000 years ago. But before that, they lived in caves for generation after generation, and they left behind huge piles of petrified dung. And when Ken started inspecting ground sloth dung, he saw some very familiar looking plant remains. They were full of Joshua tree fruits and seeds, showing that this was, in fact, the plant's missing long distance seed disperser. So if ground sloths were still around now, Ken believes that Joshua trees would be adapting to modern climate change just fine. But in their absence, pack rats can't move the seeds far enough or fast enough, and the trees are at risk of disappearing. So from an evolutionary standpoint, this is a classic example of the conundrum of specialization. Joshua trees evolved a suite of features that made them dependent upon seed dispersal by sloth. The size and the height of their fruits appeal to little else in the southwestern American landscape. So when conditions are stable, that kind of works very well. So there's often an evolutionary drive towards specialization over periods of stasis. But when things change, it can be a vulnerability. And in this case, the loss of the disperser combined with rapid climate change puts the Joshua tree at risk. So the Joshua Tree story then is an important reminder that climate change doesn't just impact one species at a time. It impacts relationships, which really are the foundations of ecosystems. And that's part of what makes it so difficult to predict the future of a climate change, of biology and a climate in a world with rapid climate change. Now, the Joshua Tree story, I also enjoy, not just because just the thought of a giant ground sloth is really, really cool, which it is, but it also reminds us that the changes we are making now to ecosystems are not limited to the present. They can take hundreds or even thousands of years to play out in unpredictable ways. Even if those ancient hunters had all been trained in biology, it's unlikely they would have predicted that their taste for roasted sloth flesh would inconvenience a large yucca plant struggling to adapt to climate change 12,000 years in the future. Similarly, when we lose biodiversity, when we change ecosystems, when we force change in the climate of this planet, we don't know what we're messing with. So we have been talking today about the challenges of climate change, things like timing mismatches and extreme weather. And we've been talking about responses from plasticity to evolution. And I have to tell you, we haven't even in our 40 minutes or so scratched the surface. Consider movement, the first of option in that MAD acronym. Between 25 and 85% of species on the planet are already shifting their ranges in response to climate change, fanning out across continents and across oceans in search of temperatures and conditions that they're used to. Now, even at the low end of that estimate, that's a quarter of all life on Earth. Climate-driven upheavals are impacting all kinds of fundamental ecological processes and relationships, from competition to predation, hybridization, parasitism, and yes, even extinction. The mouse-like bramblecea melomes is an Australian species. It recently became the first mammal that we know of, the first confirmed casualty to climate change when all of its known habitat was inundated by sea levels. So studying climate change biology doesn't make scientists worry less about the crisis, but it can help us to worry smarter, allocating scarce resources to the species that need help the most. That's an important tool at a personal level too, as we all try to allocate our limited emotional capital to this crisis. It lets us know what to worry about. Yes, climate change is daunting, but I argue that it deserves our curiosity as well as our concern. Because after all, it's hard to solve a problem if you aren't even interested in it. And with that, I would like to open up with thanks to many people for providing images for our presentation today. I would like to open things up to any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Thor. That was a really interesting talk. Yeah, super interesting. I really enjoyed it. So if anyone else has any questions, make sure, yeah, just put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I can read them out to Thor. But in the meantime, seeing as we don't have any immediate questions, I guess I'll start off with one. Um, so do you think that we should maybe shift our perspective of animals from them as being victims of climate change to focusing more on like their resilience and how they could potentially adapt to climate change to take a more sort of positive perspective, or do you think it's important to like have the balance between both?
Oh, I think we need a balance between those perspectives, but I think we make a mistake when which we often have been portraying climate change as something where we change the climate and plants and animals just all go belly up. They just can't take it. But which is not what's happening in ecosystems. We see this all the time in what we can measure and learn about in nature. We see adaptations taking place. And if we can learn what makes certain species successful in adapting to this crisis, it doesn't just help us manage natural resources, it can inform our own response as well. So the species that we see doing well tend to be these species with high levels of plasticity, the ability to change behavior, the ability to even change physiology in response to changes in the climate. We also see resilience in generalists, species that have the ability to get along in all sorts of conditions. Over their evolutionary history, they have taken the approach of being generalists rather than specialists. This is a real contrast that we see in nature and something where we see, from an evolutionary perspective, tension between those two strategies. In times of change, it pays off to be a generalist. In times of stasis, it pays off often to be a specialist. And so now that we're entering this period of rapid change, those generalists have a real edge, and we can then focus more on those specialized relationships like pollination and so forth. So understanding the responses that we see playing out around us in nature is absolutely crucial to managing the crisis.
Right, thank you. Okay, we've got lots of questions coming in now, so I'll start with the Q&A box. So Bethan asks, do you have any information of primates adapting to climate change?
Oh, what a marvelous question. And so there are certainly studies going on um, about the adaptations of primates. In a lot of cases, you see, some behavioral plasticity. Primates like us are famous for, big brains and the ability to change behaviors quickly and adapt in that way. So we do see examples of behavioral plasticity playing out as a response to environmental change. But we also have concerns, again, when we start to look at some of the more specialized habitats. And you start to look at creatures like mountain gorillas with limited habitats. So we talk about a primate that is specialized, again, on particular high elevation habitats. And we look at this all the time in climate change biology, where we worry about mountaintops because as things heat up, lower elevation plants and animals begin to move up, seeking their comfort zone, right? They migrate to the places that reflect the conditions of their past. But what about the creatures that are already at the top? So if those creatures, the mountain gorillas, are to survive in places like Buindi in Uganda, Ngahinga, and the Virunga volcanoes that straddle the border of Congo and Rwanda and Uganda and so forth, it's going to take a lot of behavioral plasticity. You're going to have to see a real change in diet and habit, particularly in the Virunga population, which is at a higher elevation. So it remains to be seen what will happen there. But again, understanding how these responses play out helps us to focus on those species that are probably, and those populations that are at the highest risk, those that are more specialized. Whereas if you look out across at some of the lowland populations, you also see climate change impacting those habitats, but you have already a greater generalization in how they use those habitats. So maybe some more flexibility, some more plasticity behaviorally in those places. And before we move on, it brings up a really good thing that we always have to keep in mind that hasn't yet come up in our discussion, and that is climate change in some cases is the least of their worries, right? I mean, we forget often when we focus in on climate change that this is just one more stressor that we are adding to the stressors we've already put on populations, particularly, for some of these rare creatures and large-bodied creatures like the primates, right? Habitat loss was already creating a crisis. Hunting and habitat loss was creating a crisis for these animals long before anyone was worried about their carbon.
Thank you. Jane asks, wondering about the little orcs, will that adaptation of behavior continue to work for them long term?
Excellent question. So in a lot of ways, we think about these adaptations as buying time. How much time does, oh, that's really great. Little ox, they've made this switch. How much time did that buy them? Right. And we think that in those habitats, it's maybe as long as 200 years before the glacial melt will be reduced to the point where you no longer have that uh, uh, curtain of plankton for them to feed upon. And the hope is then by earning 200 years more to adapt, there will be other opportunities that they'll be able to take advantage of. Who knows? It's too soon to say, but it certainly changes the immediate scenario, which was that these poor auks were just going to wink out over most of their range. Now we think, okay, they've got some more stability that we weren't thinking about. Maybe we can turn our immediate concern to some of the less adaptable creatures out there.
That's good news for the orc. Yeah, Diane asks, oh, never mind, not a question. She just says she feels more optimistic and able to manage emotional investment, so she thanks you for the talk. Um, Dylan asks, that they've heard people arguing for the intentional introduction of non-native plants because they flower at the right time for the pollinators and fill the gap that native plants are no longer filling. Do you have any thoughts on this?
This is something that, boy, if you ever want to start an argument, you just bring up this topic in a room full of biologists and just let it go. It's fabulous. But this idea of assisted migration, in a sense, and there's a really good example that we've already touched upon, and that is the Joshua tree example, right? So we know there's habitat for Joshua trees that is becoming suitable, but they're not reaching that habitat. Do we go and move them into the places that are now becoming suitable for them? Similarly, we see lots of opportunities for assisted migration in places where, as your question pointed out, you have a mismatch developing between flowering times and pollinator times. Can we bring southern population, maybe not strictly non-native, but populations from the southern part of the range of a wildflower, for example, that do bloom earlier? Can we bring that north? These are very active points of debate in biology and botany. And one of the arguments that people make in favor of it is to look for examples where it's very clearly, human-driven changes that have caused the problem. Then do you then have a justification for this sort of assisted migration? That's what they talk about in terms of the Joshua tree. Well, we killed all the sloths and now we're changing the climate. We made the mess. Let's clean it up. But there are, of course, drawbacks potentially to any of these sorts of movements, right? I listened for that statistic of 25 to 85% of plants and animals shifting their ranges in response to the climate crisis. Well, if you think about what that means from an ecological perspective, it means we're creating novel ecosystems. We are mixing together plants and animals as all of these creatures settle out into new home ranges, wherever they happen to end up. We're mixing together populations of plants and animals that do not have a history in the recent past, their recent evolutionary past of mixing together. And it's really hard to predict the consequences of that. So there are various ways you'll hear in your room full of arguing biologists how to perceive that problem then. On the one hand, people will say, well, we made this mess. We can move some species where we know they're going to thrive, and it may help these ecosystems. And some people will warn of the consequences. The people on the other side will say, well, we're already moving everything around and scrambling it up. So these directed migrations then uh, may not have any particularly negative impact because it's already sort of a free for all out there, right? So you'll see these things go back and forth, back and forth. And the other, one side saying, well, we have lots of examples where introducing species has gone awry. So it just goes back and forth. But I think that we're at the point where, experiments are happening and natural, if you will, natural experiments are happening, quote unquote, but you have so many species moving that we see this sort of thing already playing out. And so we're going to have a lot of data on it in the decades ahead.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting. So Eleanor asks, what characteristics make organisms more vulnerable to extinction driven by climate change?
Ah, yes. So the characteristics that make creatures vulnerable, number one, in terms of habit and evolutionary strategy, is specialization. And we've talked about it a couple of times. The specialists are at the highest risk right now because those relationships are easy to break apart, and you don't have the flexibility necessarily to fill in the gaps. So specialists also, and we've also mentioned this, higher elevation populations, even if it's not the species, but the populations of a species that are at the highest elevations, where do they go? Where do they go? And we see what we call not my term, but a very memorable one nonetheless, the elevator to extinction, right? In that if you look, and now there's good data on this, Ben Freeman and others have really got great stuff going on studying tropical mountainsides, right? And going back and resurveying places that were surveyed for birds or other fauna. They've done butterfly or moths or butterflies and things like that. Um, People who surveyed elevational gradients on mountains decades ago, you go back and you can see that in fact most of the species are in fact moving up the mountains. Where do the ones on top go? They wink out in most cases. So if you're really looking for the vulnerabilities, you look for specialists on the tops of mountains. Those creatures are having a rough time.
And Peter asks, to what extent do you feel that our emotional connection to so many species blurs our perception of the changes driven by climate in understanding the science behind it and skews our view of considering it objectively?
Oh, it's hard even for scientists to separate those things. I mean, we have emotional attachments. And one of the ways that it really impacts our ability to study and to plan and to manage these sorts of crises is as how it impacts what we know about in the first place, right? Because we develop emotional connections to certain creatures. The mountain gorillas will end up on a postcard in a heartbeat. You'll get it on a t-shirt. You can get whatever you want, calendars and whole coffee table books and so forth devoted to it. Phorid flies, on the other hand, which are extremely interesting and complicated little creatures. It's hard to even find an image on the internet of a phorid fly. And it's a hyper-diverse and very fascinating group of creatures, right? So our emotions impact what we know about and impact what we study, and therefore impact what we manage and plan for. So, as scientists, it's always good for us to remind ourselves to step away from that when we can, and to try to study the creatures that are most fundamental and most important to sustaining some stability in these changing ecosystems. It's not always the fancy megafauna that we're so fond of. It's often the little things that run the world.
Yeah, definitely. Great. And Peter asks, never mind, that's not a question, I think. Sorry about that. I'll move to the chat now. So I think some of these questions have already been repeated, but I think this is a new one. Sophie asks, wondering how you think invasive species fit or have a role to play into adaptation to climate change. I think that you touched on this briefly already in one of your other answers, but if you've got any more to say about that.
Well, invasive species really offer us, a window into this world where so many species are on the move, right? In that if you look at, I would imagine the numbers are very similar on your island as they are on mine. But if you look at the flora in a place like this, about a third of the species in the flora are non-native, but only a very few of those are what we would call invasive. So there is this ability for mixing to take place in a more benign way for many species, but certain species go crazy and take over and really outcompete native species and so forth. And learning what we can from invasive species studies about the characteristics that make that more likely will help in a way to predict what's going to happen in these novel ecosystems we're creating now with so many species moving around.
And Rebecca asks, how can we prioritize what ecosystems and species to conserve and protect against climate change? Again, you briefly touched on this already with the small, yeah, small being the mighty, but you got any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it really is triage in some ways. And so we do look for, prioritizing the high risk areas, the high risk habitats, the high risk species that we know of, in terms of what to take on first. Those things we've been talking about in terms of specialization and at-risk habitats are the place we focus our energies first.
Great. And then Gwen asks, conservation work in the UK is now looking at improving connections between sites to let species move themselves, as well as improving existing sites to buffer the effects of climate change, giving species the time to adapt and or move. I don't know if that is really a question. Never mind. I think we've
Well, it's a
actually
good
got,
point, though. I mean,
it's,
I'll
it's a
just
good point.
I'll make one comment on that. We haven't
Yeah,
touched on before, but that is even, the importance of what we call microhabitats, right? Even at a small scale, when you are looking at how, again, some of these less fancy creatures make a living, microhabitats become important. What is it like on the northern side of a little hill in your nature preserve? Look at elevational gradients on a small scale, and you'll see these same larger themes playing out. So there is a real importance in connectivity, in elevational conservation, even at the local scale, because you will see those little forward flies and other important unknown creatures um, going through some of the same things on a local scale that we see writ large with some of the, more migratory birds and other things, butterflies and so forth, that are really on the move at a larger scale. So that kind of microhabitat emphasis is very important for local conservation.
right. And I think we've just got one more question here from Alex. So mitigation strategies like assisted migration are resource intense for us to carry out. Can you offer any advice for engaging policymakers towards allocating funds and resources beyond the fluffy poster child species, perhaps?
Yeah, that's always a challenge, isn't it? I mean, this goes back to the earlier question about our emotional attachments. What we often try to do in conservation then is, sort of play both sides of the coin a little bit and look for those species that people are fond of that can act as what we call umbrellas. And if we do the conservation work for, the mountain gorilla or whatever it may be, the habitat preserved for that creature will in effect preserve the habitats for the agromyzid flies and the various moths that no one's knows anything about. So you look, in a sense, you can try to strategize, take advantage of the emotional connections to get more conservation work. And again, in this era, what we're looking for oftentimes are these sorts of elevational gradients and thinking about connectivity and where species are going to be moving. So if you can preserve a mountainside, you're getting a little more bang for your buck now than you are if you're conserving something totally flat. Because that flat area, the whole habitat's going to change to something else. So it's harder to justify, uh, uh, you know, a conservation measure for a single species in that regard. But if you look at where species are moving, north, south, up, down, you can sometimes get more conservation value for some of these emotional connections to particular species.
Great. Well, we've got 3 minutes left. We've had a couple more questions pop in, so I'll just do one more, sort of linking into that last point, actually. Is there ever a time to consider that an animal is not worth saving because it is too specialized? For example, they've given the example of the giant panda that is by some considered to have reached a dead end.
Oh, I know. Yeah, again, here we are arguing in a room full of biologists. You can expend huge amounts of scarce resources, right? Trying to save things that we love that may not be viable over the long haul without our help in that regard. And, pandas and some of these other creatures, certainly qualify. So again, it's almost a philosophical question, in terms of conservation. Is it worth the connection to nature that people seem to derive from some of these creatures, regardless of whether or not it's having a sort of an ecosystem level impact in terms of conservation. Often it does. If you can get the umbrella species effect, that's great. But there are also projects that are, you know, that fill the need for storytelling in biology, in a sense. I mean, if you look at some of the work going on with reintroducing migratory uh, birds, where they, where they're following the ultralight glider to relearn, the migration patterns. My God, what an intensive project that is, right? But it's a story. And when you look at the competition for attention in our society, this increasingly indoor media and celebrity and entertainment focused society, we do need stories that can compete. And so there is, philosophically speaking, an importance to some of these almost extravagances in terms of conservation because they're expensive. But do they get people to pay attention to nature in a tech-driven world? The argument there is that yes, indeed, and those stories can be quite important.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, great. Thank you so much. That was really interesting to talk, and it seems that everyone seems to have enjoyed it from everyone's comments. So, is there any sort of last words you want to say about your book or anything else before we end?
Oh, of course, yeah. The book, plenty more of stories of similar nature in the book. And I appreciate all of your attention and your interest in this topic. And I hope that these ideas will give you something to think about on your next walk in the woods.
Great. Thank you very much. All right. Thank you everyone for attending, and hope you had a good time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye now.